Well, thank you, Mr. Ned Bullard, Chief Content Officer of Bloomberg NEF, all the way from America with his presentation. Thank you so much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we need to go into the next session immediately as we are running a bit behind time. It's the first panel discussion on ASEAN 2030 Changing Landscapes for Sustainable Trade. The panelists for this session are Dr. Alexey Kravchenko, Economic Affairs Officer at United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Latifahaida Latif, Head of Analysis and Monitoring on Finance and Socioeconomic Issues Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, Her Excellency Ambassador Ms. Sandra Jensen Landi, Ambassador of Denmark to Singapore and Brunei, Professor Karin Costa Vazquez, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean at OP Jindal Global University and Fudan Scholar at Fudan University. The moderator for this session has more than 30 years of professional experience in multinational and national corporations and international organizations. She is a former global mobility tax process leader for Asia Pacific of General Electric or GE, who also once led GE Volunteers as Director for South Asia. She led collaborative project initiatives with local and international profit and non-profit organizations, government institutions, volunteering, and community service agencies. During her career with GE, she was awarded the Jack Welch Elfund of the Year and the Philip Award, a global award for excellence in volunteer and community activities. Please welcome the Executive Director of Indonesia Global Compact Network, Mrs. Josephine Satyono. Over to you, Mrs. Josephine.
Thank you, Mr. Rahim. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us remarkable speakers, and I just want to mention again, they are Dr. Alexey Kravchenko, Economic Affairs of UN ECOSOC for the Asia and the Pacific, and Ms. Latifahaida Latif, Head of Analysis and Monitoring on Finance and Socioeconomic Issues, the Asian Secretariat, Her Excellency Sandra Jensen Landi, Ambassador of Denmark to Singapore and Brunei, and Professor Karin Costa Vazquez, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean at OP Jindal Global University and Fudan Scholar at Fudan University. Welcome to our first panel of discussion today, ASEAN 2030, Changing Landscapes for Sustainable Trade. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Josephine Satyono, Executive Director of Indonesia Global Compact Network, and today I will moderate this panel of discussion. Since 2019, the world has been gripped by a health crisis of staggering proportions, resulting in great economic and social losses. And now, despite the crippling impact COVID-19 has had on ASEAN, its long-term outlook remains positive as it is projected to become the world's fourth largest economy by 2030. As a bloc, ASEAN has explicitly committed to sustainability in the region. However, according to the most recent United Nations review on progress, the region is not on track to meet any of the SDGs by 2030. In fact, it is even regressing on critical goals such as climate action goal 13 and life below water goal 14. Moving forward, amidst rising concerns and pressure from major economies such as the United States, European Union, and China for greater trade and commerce to be sustainable, ASEAN can no longer rest on its laurels and rely on the same growth drivers to guide its future trajectory. Ladies and gentlemen, In the next 40 minutes, we will have an interesting dialogue with our remarkable speakers. And to begin the discussion, please welcome Dr. Alexey Kravchenko, who will present the findings for the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021. Dr. Alexey, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josephine. Can we please share the presentation? Let me present then. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to be invited to talk to you today. I'd like to present to you the main findings and recommendations of the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021, Accelerating Climate Smart Trade and Investment for Sustainable Development. This report was written in collaboration with colleagues from UNEP and UNCTAD. So while globalization has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in Asia Pacific region alone, the economic growth supported by existing trade and investment policies has come at a pretty steep environmental cost. Climate change is making the Asia Pacific region more hazardous. Greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the main driving force of climate change. Asia Pacific region accounts for about 38% of the global GDP, but 54% of the global greenhouse emissions. Since 1990, global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 50%, where in the Asia-Pacific region they have more than doubled. In China alone, they have quadrupled, and in India more than tripled. China and India are responsible for 24% and 7% of global emissions, respectively. Yet on the per capita basis, China's emissions are less than half of those of the United States, and India's are 7 times less. What's more, developed countries' consumption and emissions are typically higher than their territorial emissions due to emissions embedded in the international trade. While the gap between the consumption and territorial emissions remains high, it only accounts for a relatively small share of the overall increase in the emissions. This means that the bulk of the greenhouse gas emissions in the Asia-Pacific region has been from the increased consumptions due to increased economic development in the region, rather than from manufacturing of products destined for developed markets. So this report is focused on how trade and investment policies can be more climate smart and help to address climate change. But first, what exactly is the link between trade investment and greenhouse gas emissions? Well, trade contributes to emissions due to transportation and trade procedures. Trade also leads to greater economic activity, further increasing emissions. Trade-related regulations can be favorable for climate actions. For example, climate-related provisions are now increasingly used in trade agreements. At the same time, some countries in ASEAN as well try to reduce their environmental regulations to try to attract FDI. Depending on country-specific production processes, trade can either decrease or increase emissions. For example, in the UK, even accounting for transport-related emissions, New Zealand lamb contributes to 4 times fewer emissions than the UK lamb, mostly because New Zealand's sheep graze outside the whole year rather than rely on brought-in feed. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, trade is crucial for spreading technologies to attain green economies and reduce emissions. So as part of this report, we took some stock taken. And what we found was that while there has been some improvement since 2015, all countries in Asia Pacific, ASEAN including, have substantial room to make their trade and investments climate smarter. I'm not going to go through the whole report, but I wanted to highlight some recommendations that we came up to achieve greater climate smart policies. We analyzed barriers to trading climate smart and other environmental goods, and we found that average tariffs applied to carbon intensive fuels in Asia Pacific are lower than the tariffs applied to environmental goods. The data on non-tariff measures are telling the same story. So our first recommendation is to liberalize trade in climate smart and other environmental goods and services. This can be done unilaterally or as part of trade agreements, perhaps part of ASEAN, or ideally at multilateral level. Next recommendation is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Our simulations presented in Chapter 6 show that this is one of the most low-hanging fruit to climate action. Latest data show that Asia-Pacific economies spend more than $175 billion annually on fossil fuel subsidies. These funds can be potentially used better and more directly to support those people in need. Our next recommendation is to adopt climate-smart non-tariff measures. At this point, economies in the region apply only these type of measures to 6.2% of their imports. And some of the examples include efficiency requirements, efficiency labeling, and deforestation measures on imports. The fourth recommendation is perhaps more appropriate in this forum, is to encourage climate-smart investment and private sector initiatives. There's a need to transform 4 key economic sectors identified in the report and to make them more climate-smart, and this will take a lot of effort. The energy sector supports all other sectors, and the key to make it a climate-smart is to increase the share of the renewable energy generation. Production of cement, iron, and steel are all emission-intensive, and there's urgent need to decarbonize them. Different actions can be taken to reduce emissions in the transport sectors, one of which is to invest in cleaner modes of transport. In the construction sector, actions include greening building through increased energy efficiency. The chapter in the report identifies some private sector initiatives. Some of them can be pushed by the government policies, such as sustainability reporting requirements. At the same time, some large companies, particularly in the ASEAN region, are doing this on their own, for example, through setting up internal carbon pricing mechanisms. The fifth recommendation is to accelerate trade digitalization. One of the findings that we have is that if you go from the currently relatively inefficient set of trade procedures to full paperless trade for each transactions, you can save equivalent of about 1.5 trees. This looks relatively small, but if you multiply this by all the trade transactions in the Asia-Pacific region, that's 400 million trees through trade digitalization. The sixth recommendation is to transition to climate-smart transport. Every time we think about international trade and climate change, the first thing comes to our mind is really the transport part. CO2 emissions from the freight transport, both international and domestic, have been estimated to account for about 42% of all transport-related CO2 emissions. The seventh recommendation is to incorporate climate-smart considerations in regional trade agreements and investment agreements. We're already seeing that. In fact, after 2005, this has been more common, as you can see in the graph, but there's scope to do more. One agreement worth mentioning specifically is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, supported by New Zealand in collaboration with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. It seeks to promote many of the recommendations I've mentioned, namely removal of fossil fuel subsidies, removing barriers to trade in environmental goods and services, and developing guidelines on voluntary eco-labeling. The eighth recommendation is to prepare for carbon pricing. As of time of this report, only about 7.8% of greenhouse gas emissions in the region were covered by some sort of pricing versus 21.5% globally. In addition to difference in coverage, there's significant disparity in prices. For example, the price in Kazakhstan emission trading scheme is only about $1.18 per ton of CO2, where in Sweden, the carbon tax is $137 per ton of CO2. According to some estimates, carbon prices need to be about $50 to $100 per ton by 2030 to cost-effectively reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And nevertheless, the trend is clear that the price of emissions will increase will be accounted for in the Asia Pacific and beyond, and countries need to start preparing for that. So our analysis shows that carbon pricing does come at economic cost when it's implemented, with marginal windfalls to economies without those carbon prices because of these carbon leakages. Now, this happens when some production moves from countries with high carbon prices to countries with low carbon prices. And so to address these sort of carbon leakages and associated loss of competitiveness, some of the major trade partners outside of the region, particularly the European Union, are looking at implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms to plug in these leakages. In the report, we look at the impact of these border adjustment mechanisms, and we find that overall the impact is quite limited, except for South and Southwest Asia, where there's no real carbon pricing mechanism at this stage. So the next recommendation is to incorporate climate consideration in the COVID-19 crisis recovery packages. This report was written in the midst of the pandemic, and countries that can afford it are putting in place recovery spending packages. It's extremely important that these have actions considerations. Obvious example would be to invest in green transport technologies and railways. There are, however, some limitations because the current multilateral trade rules may make some of such spending a little bit more difficult. So we're hoping these can be facilitated at the WTO level. The final recommendation is that capacity for making climate smart policy needs to be strengthened. That means training of government officials and policymakers. And we here at ESCAP, together with the UNEP and UNCTAD, stand ready to support this. So I thank you for your attention and invite you to read our report for more details. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Alexey. Very, very interesting presentation of the report. Now, following your report, which mentioned climate smart actions needed in energy, industrial, transport, constructions, this obviously lead to, of course, greener production and greener economy. Now, ASEAN's transition toward the greener economy is estimated at $1 trillion in economic opportunities. Which sectors do you think would be benefited by this shift?
I mean, clearly those sectors in clean energy and energy efficiency, engineering, manufacturing, construction industries, and not only this going to have monetary implication, it's also possible to have job implications with many jobs coming up here. But I think it's important to highlight that, particularly when it comes to climate change policies, overall, there's going to be economic costs, what we found in our simulations. There's going to be jobs losses, and it's important for government to support transitioning of workers, particularly low-skilled workers, into these greener sectors, because there's going to be, even though in net it may be beneficial in the long run, in short term there's going to be transitions and they're going to be painful. As I said, we do estimate that this is going to cost overall for the economies, but the costs of inactions are much higher. So there is real no choice but to go ahead and try to move towards greener economies.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Isis. What do you think are some pressing issues that need to be addressed to deliver the sustainable growth in the Asian region, like tackling supply chain emissions, perhaps gender equality, sustainable finance? What do
Right.
you think?
Yeah, well, I think that progress towards sustainable growth and sustainable development can essentially be measured in the achievements towards the SDGs, towards the development goals and targets. And as was noted, I think somewhere earlier, that the progress towards SDG 13 on climate action is particularly lacking. So this is, I think, in terms of sustainability, this is the most pressing issues. But you know, so at this stage, looking at the SDG progress report, none of the targets are on track to be achieved in the region or globally, to be honest. I do think that there has been some progress. For example, last flagship report that we've done was on included bits on plastic waste, and since then there has been actually some really good progress. In 2019, the Basel Convention was extended to include trade in plastic waste as requiring export and import clearance, and this has seen dramatic reductions in amount of plastic waste going in Malaysia and in Indonesia and Thailand, and I think this has the potential to really make a difference. And we've seen countries are increasingly having bans on plastic bags and plastic straws and so forth, and I think that's a step in the right direction. So it always requires concerted government effort, government policies to support and the companies and these initiatives. But also, more importantly, it requires intergovernmental cooperation, because if you have a policy in one country that's not mirrored by another country, basically it'll just move. So for example, here in 2018, when China banned import of plastic, it just leaked out to all the countries in Southeast Asia, and then they had to do this together, coordinating their own plastic ban. So coordination intergovernmentally is the key towards achieving sustainable development.
Very important indeed. And it's good to hear, to know that there is a progress on the waste and plastics. And I hope that there will be, like you mentioned, clear policy and intergovernmental, alignment on what needs to be done going forward. Now, let me turn to Ambassador Sandra Jensen. Ambassador Sandra, Dr. Alexey mentioned some of the pressing issue, uh, that needs to be tackled. Do you agree with him, or do you have a different opinion, or if you want to address some more?
No, I completely agree. I thought it was, first of all, thank you for that interesting presentation, Dr. Kravchenko.
Yes.
I really appreciated the points pointed out, and it's completely in line with what we work on from a Danish perspective and from an EU perspective in this region, and also what we hear. Because one thing is that we would all like to see more achievements on the SDGs, but I think there's a lot of different things that pulls us in that direction. It's not just about doing good; it's also about making sure that the production sector of this region will actually survive. Because as was pointed out in the report, carbon pricing is coming. You will see some increased cost of the environmental impact. We are moving in that direction globally, and I think for the production sector of this region, which is so incredibly important to so many people's lives and to the economies of the countries in this region, you need to look at it in a different way. We need to ensure that there's access to renewable energy for the production companies, for example. We need to have a more clean transport system. So it's both to do good for everyone's sake, but it's also actually to make sure that the economy thrives also going ahead.
Ambassador, in your opinion, who should be driving the sustainable trade agenda in ASEAN? Is it government, multinationals, or investors? Who do you think?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is that drive comes actually from everywhere. I can say I sit here in Singapore, and this is a finance center, and it's very, very clear to see that the finance environment is really moving on this agenda right now. They're talking ESG all the time. They're being pushed to make many more clean investments, green investments. So, and of course, I mean, to be honest, once the money starts moving, we're going to see more changes. But I think it is also coming from multinational. I mean, we're quite satisfied with the outcome of COP26. Of course, we could always wish for more, but it was a very clear message, particularly on the fossil fuel, which was also a part of the recommendations. And we see a lot of consumers asking for more. So they were not on your list there, but I think that's where we're going to see a big drive for change, is that when the consumers start asking for different products, for sustainable, for the impact of the whole chain, right? From production, from how labor is treated. That's a very, very important driver of change, and that's what we see in Europe. I have to say the younger generation is really pushing the governments also to do differently. So everyone has to be on board, basically.
Yeah, I agree completely. There's actually a study which mentioned a consumer says that they will switch buying in products if the corporation or the industry that produces the product doesn't take care of their environment or their employees or the community. So I completely agree with you that it impacts, and it's and this would be the wake up call for industries going forward. So thank you, Ambassador. Now I would like to turn to Ms. Latifahaida Latif. Ms. Latifa, the world just had the COP26 finish in Glasgow on climate. Can you share how the outcome from COP26 influence sustainable trade in Asia?
Thank you, Ms. Josephine. And thank you for the questions, because I think it is highly important to connect how the outcome of COP26 actually will have an impact on the region, especially in terms of trade. Well, the COP26 just ended about 2 weeks ago. It's a bit premature to see how it influenced, but one thing for sure I can say is that the commitments made by individual ASEAN member countries will definitely change the contours of trade in the region. One that will actually be geared towards more low carbon and sustainable choices. And why I say this is because almost all ASEAN member countries at their national level, individual level, actually have made some form of commitments at COP26, either from reversing forest loss and land degradation to limiting fossil fuel fundings and transitioning away from coal. And what this means is that these commitments will actually have impact on every aspect of the supply chain, from how we produce to how we consume. And it is important for ASEAN businesses to start making the transition for future competitiveness, and also like what Ambassador Sandra mentioned, for longevity of the business, because as there's heightened awareness on the impact of climate change, the demand will also change towards a more sustainable production. So it's not just for saving the planet, so to speak, but also for longevity of the business. So it is inevitable, the way I see it, for ASEAN businesses to transition into a more sustainable form of production, and to make sustainable choices. As a region, ASEAN may not be the largest carbon emitter, but we are highly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And transition is really, really important to ensure that ASEAN businesses are resilient against, the shock arising from climate events. And like I mentioned earlier, with the heightened awareness on climate issues, consumer behavior globally will definitely change to a more sustainable form of production. And last month, ASEAN leaders, or ASEAN Economic Council, that was made up of ASEAN economic ministers, have actually endorsed the ASEAN Framework for Circular Economy. And this covers, it touches upon a few areas in Dr. Alexey's report in terms of the recommendation, because it seeks to close the loop to our existing linear model of consumption of take, make, use, and dispose. And the goal is to create a resilient economy, achieve resource efficiency, and also sustainable growth. If I can just briefly share, the framework actually touches upon outline five strategic priorities. First is standard harmonization, and this relates to what Dr. Alexey mentioned earlier, that currently the sustainable products perhaps have higher level of tariff, and we need to have a standard harmonization across the region to ease the movement of these products, and also to look at trade openness, ensure that any trade barriers in the form of tariff or non-tariff measures are kept at a minimum for circular products and services. And third strategic priorities is to actually use leverage and technology to green the supply chain. And there are several initiatives also being proposed under these strategic priorities. And of course, financing is critical in mobilizing the funds, and access to financing has also been identified. And at the sideline of COP26, ASEAN actually has announced the ASEAN Green Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which will be a single common language to mobilize finance in green projects around the region. And finally, efficient use of energy and other resources. And clearly, the use of energy underlies all economic activities, and this is one of the priority to be looked at as well. So if it circles back to, I think, the recommendation given outlined in the report, some of these areas have been identified, and the framework has actually provide a structured pathway for the region to transition into a low carbon economy. And this can also be used by the private sector to guide their transition. to plan their transition. And I hope that private sector also take the opportunity to look at how they could support the region transition into a low carbon model.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's very, very interesting. I, we learn from this pandemic, of course, and in many cases, we are pushed to adapt to the new normal, like digitalization. Like now, we are conducting this panel on a virtual basis. So my next question is, what role does digitalization play in realizing the region's promise to achieve the SDGs?
If I can just frame it in one sentence, I would say it plays a key role. It is an enabler to basically accelerate the achieving of the SDG goals. Just to frame this conversation, last year ASEAN actually saw 40 million new users who went online for the first time during the pandemic. And the pandemic actually forced quick adoption of a digital platform. It is now being used as a tool to monitor as a public health management. We use our COVID-19 app to report our health status, to manage vaccine distribution. It is currently being used for that. And I mentioned the new additional 40 million new users online, right? As a result of this, the e-commerce sector has actually increased by 33% in ASEAN, and with projected revenue to reach about $80 billion by 2024. And digital payment is expected to rise to $1 trillion by 2025. So the potential or the potential of digitalization to be used as a platform to accelerate the achieving of SDG is really immense. And because of that, recently ASEAN leaders has actually adopted and endorsed the fourth industrial revolution consolidated strategy for ASEAN that looked into digitalization to transform and contribute to social progress and sustainable development. For example, digitalization, the use of big data or blockchain can be used to actually identify environmental impact along the supply chain. So there are a lot of potential that can be used for IR also looked at smart farming, smart manufacturing, how we can actually green the supply chain. And beyond that, beyond the economic activities, the digital platform has also been used during the pandemic for the tourism sector. Maybe you'll be interested to know that the cultural artifacts across ASEAN can be viewed three-dimensionally from a digital platform.
It's interesting.
And you can use 360 virtual reality to actually visit UNESCO cultural heritage site across the region without creating.
Really
Exactly.
amazing.
So you don't have to create additional carbon footprint, and digital platform has immense opportunity for this. So I can only say that it's a great potential enabler and a really key to the transformation and achieving the SDGs.
Thank you so much. I might come back to you with more on the ASEAN track, but I would like to turn to Professor Karin. Professor Karin, as the world's second largest economy and the largest trade partner to ASEAN, China has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060 and has taken visible steps in tackling climate-related issues within its country and beyond. Could you share with us some significant policies or initiatives which would potentially impact trade in the ASEAN region?
Thank you so much, Josephine. And it's interesting to give a perspective from the Chinese side as not sitting in ASEAN countries and not coming from an ASEAN country myself. But if I had to point one significant change in this landscape is the commitments that China made last year at the UN General Assembly to neutralize carbon emissions by 2060, peak by 2030, and neutralize completely by 2060. and it's a hugely ambitious goal. Just to give you a few numbers, it took China approximately 10 years to decrease coal consumption, the percentage of coal in the energy matrix from 70 to 60, meaning that we have the next 4 decades to reduce from 60 to 0. So it's highly ambitious. It will take a massive effort across the economy, and these commitments have already been translated into practice, as we've seen earlier this year with the launch of the carbon market in China. Also, there were no new projects for coal plants in China. The Chinese government has also forbidden investments in coal plants or coal-related investments abroad, outside China. And the several regulations that have been implemented to green the Belt and Road Initiative, just to mention some of the recent measures taken. But I think one important aspect that we should watch out for is how this changing landscape in China will impact trade and investments globally. Um, as we discussed the level of ambition and whether China will or will not meet its carbon commitments, uh, if it does, or even if it almost does, it will already have a huge impact on other countries and ASEAN countries as the largest trade partner, having China as the largest trade partner, um, and especially on fossil fuel markets, oil, oil exports, with first coal exports, right? Coal markets will the demand for coal in China is likely to decrease very sharply if the country is to meet its
Yeah.
commitments. This will impact coal markets outside China at a very abrupt and rapid scale. Second, oil and gas. Not as
Mm.
abrupt or intense as coal, because it will still have some margin to peak or grow until 2030, until it starts to decline more sharply from 30 to 60. But this will also have an impact on those countries in the region who are now exporting crude and refined oil to China. Um, but not only the impacts, also the opportunities that these transformations will bring, technologies and investments in green energy markets and technologies, and so on and so forth.
Well, thank you, Prof. Karin. With the changing landscape for sustainable trade, and with the renewed focus on sustainability and low carbon transition, how do you think it will impact businesses, both large and small, in ASEAN, in terms of risk and opportunities?
Excellent. I think how countries and businesses, how much they will benefit or be impacted from a carbon neutral China will actually depend on their export profile, as already mentioned, and especially those countries that are, or companies that are in the fossil fuels will probably suffer more, but also the commitments of these countries and governments in implementing their national decarbonization plans. So we could almost think like three or four types of countries. Those that have already started to implement their decarbonization plans and are supplying raw materials that are needed for the transformation of China's energy mix. These
Right.
countries will have better chances of ramping up their relationships with China in the next years. And this is the case of countries in the European Union, for instance, which is already cooperating with China on clean energy, decarbonization technology, and carbon trading. Um, there is a middle group of countries in between, like Canada, for example, which have already started to implement national decarbonization plans and are supplying fossil fuels to China, or have not yet started to implement their decarbonization plans, but are supplying not supplying fossil fuels to China. and these have a more or more in the gray zone in terms of impacts and benefits. And last but not least, on the other extreme are those countries that have not yet started to implement their national decarbonization plans, and that are supplying raw materials that will no longer be needed, or at least not in the same quantities for China. And in the long run, these countries are more likely to see their exports and investments in the sector in fossil fuels decline, and their relations to China to be impacted. And this is the case of many ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, who are now exporting these types of products. So we really need to be aware not only of the measures that countries are taking themselves within their borders, but the dynamic relations amongst these transformations and how they will impact each other.
Yeah. Well, very, very interesting. Those countries that are impacted most for, like, reducing the fossil fuel, coal, etc., need to take ambitious steps in turning the economy to a low carbon. Professor Karin, my last question to you is in your opinion, what will sustainable trade looks like post-pandemic?
I think much has been said already in terms of the changing the commitments and how they will impact each countries. Colleagues have mentioned the adoption of sustainability standards that can demonstrate that companies and governments compliance with sustainable trade, carbon pricing. But what we've also seen during the pandemic and beyond is also how this sustainability from the perspective of sustainability of value chains. As several companies closed operations and faced shortages and interruptions in their supplies and other types of disruptions during the pandemic, many governments, and especially in developed countries, adopted protectionist measures in an attempt to increase supply chain stability and resilience. And this has impacted those countries who have a lower added value product in the chain. And this might continue or be used as a scapegoat for other, as a justification for other objectives. So these are all opportunities and challenges that we need to watch out for in the coming years.
Right. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting dialogue. I think we have just very limited time. But I think we can, in as much I would like to go back to some of you with more questions, but I think we just want to open the floor for to the audience for questions. So probably we can start with. Okay, so we have questions here. Let me see. Okay, there's one question. How can ASEAN businesses be a global leader in sustainable trade? Are there any examples? Who wants to answer this question? Probably, maybe
I
Latifah?
can jump
Yes.
in.
Yes.
Just to share, last week I had the opportunity, the privilege to actually be in a panel with the private sectors in ASEAN. And I have to say that there are a lot of ASEAN businesses, ASEAN corporates, businesses, MSMEs who are spearheading the initiatives on sustainable trade. For example, perhaps I could cite City Development Limited in Singapore. They have been really a front runner even from since 1995, before at the beginning of COP26, the COP's conference. So they have actually been there looking at transitioning into sustainable processes and practices much earlier, and also YTL Cement in Malaysia has actually looking at using renewable energy from excess heat produced by the cement factory, and trying to reduce the carbon footprint, and trying to see which processes along the line that could be can be green. So I think there are opportunities, and ASEAN businesses can definitely be a leader in sustainable, a global leader in sustainable trade. But the key is to have that, I think, to have the vision and to start transitioning, because I don't know how to emphasize this even more, that it is an inevitable, and as the world converge towards a more sustainable choices, and leave our bad habit behind. So we really need to start reform ourselves, and start looking at how we can choose better, and businesses, private sectors also need to start making this move. And there's a lot of tools to do that, I think, right now available that you can use.
Great. Thank you. We have a question number 2. One of COP's 26 shortcoming is that developed economies did not meet their 100 billion funding pledge. In your opinion, how can developed economies ensure they play a key role in funding required sustainable action for the global south? Maybe Ambassador Sandra can
Yes,
answer
I'm
that
happy
question.
to take that as a representative of a developed country here.
You can make it brief, by the way, because I
First of
think
all,
you're
I
very
completely agree. It was very. We were sad to see that we didn't reach the 100 billion funding pledge this time around. What we do see though is that we're very close now, and it looks like with the trajectory we will for sure reach it in 2023, maybe already in 2022. So we are very close. The bad news is it is far from enough. I mean, this is not. I mean, whether we reach the 100 or 120 is not going to get us there. We are going to talk about trillions we need here to make this green transition that the world needs. So I think what we are doing now in Denmark is to mobilize, the pension savings and so on, all of the money that needs to be invested for public good, really, on all of our behalf. And I think that's where we really will see a change if we can move that ahead. I will also say that we work bilaterally with a lot of countries. From Denmark, which is a small country, we work with 19 countries covering almost 60% of the global emissions on how to do these green transitions. So there's a lot going on that might not be measured in the 100 billion funding pledge, but it's actually work that we are doing and working on this together.
Well, we still have question number 3, but can we still go on, or we need to close?
I think we have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. So we'll probably can make it very quick. How do you see, this question say, how do you see a bank like HSBC with the ambition to provide between 750 billion and USD 1 trillion in financing and investment over the next 10 years for clients in all sectors to support them to progressively decarbonize and solve some of the challenges in Asia?
Maybe I can just continue because it's connected to what I just said. I don't know what HSBC's pledge is, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the type of financing we need to bring forward. But for that to take place, there's a lot of work that has to happen, which is including how do we know that an investment is green? How do we measure, a climate neutral investment? Or what do we actually count as what? And I think that is a big job that's a lot of good people are working on right now, luckily, but where we need to do much more. so we can also keep each other accountable and keep our personal savings, our banks, and our pension funds accountable.
Yeah, Dr. Alexey, you want to add some more?
Well, there was a comment here about increased cross-border trade and transportation due to the rise of e-commerce in Asia, and there's a concern that it's going to increase CO2 emissions. I just want to point out again that the relationship between trade and greenhouse gas emissions and complex, and transportation emissions is just one part of it, and not necessarily the biggest one. Just to give you an example, if you're going to take food products, a lot of people say, oh, you don't want to eat beef imported from Latin America because of all the transportation. Well, in reality, in terms of 1 kilogram of beef, the production of it contributes to 60 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. Most of it comes from cows belching, and then land use change, and transportation accounts for only about 0.3 kilograms of CO2 emissions. So that's negligible. And that's true for most food products, actually. Transportation is only a small part of it. The choices that we as consumers make often matter a lot more than the transportation to satisfy those choices. And in the cases where transportation is important, which, at the end of the day, it adds up, it's important to facilitate that through enhanced international linkages and streamlined cross-border trade procedures with digitalization.
Well, what a fruitful discussion we have today. Again, thank you for all of our remarkable panelists. But I just want to give kind of a short conclusion. Sectors benefited would be those in the clean energy efficiency, and its field. But we need also to pay more attention that aside from the economic cost that will be increasing, there would be job losses and job creations from these. There would also be environmental costs arising from this issue. ASEAN is the highly vulnerable region of the climate change impact. Now that we see progress on plastic issues, as stated by Dr. Alexey, we still need everyone, every stakeholder to unite and create policies. Coordination across region is highly needed. Digitalization could also play a big role, especially with the help from the private sectors to gain big impacts in sustainable trade. There are already real examples of ASEAN businesses to be successful in this, and there is a form of hope that we all can work on together. The key is private sector should have the vision and start transitioning. Dr. Alexey, Ms. Latifa, Ambassador Sandra, and Professor Karin, would you just please share like 30 seconds closing statements? Start with Dr. Alexey.
Put me on the spot there. Let me highlight that trade is not just transport. Without trade, we cannot share green technologies. Not one country can produce all the cells and batteries by themselves. You need international trade for green future.
Ms. Latif?
I think that we need to make the move now. There's no time to wait. Private sectors, government sectors, public sectors, everybody has to pull their weight, and we definitely need support from the private sector to also change how we produce. In addition to how we consume, so we need to make the move right now.
Ambassador Sandra?
Yeah, I agree on the right now part. And I think that what we need to, there's so many things to do, but one place to really start is to establish the green infrastructure around that can support all the production and the trade in general. And that it requires all of us.
Yeah, thank you, sorry. Professor Karin?
I just endorse what my colleagues say, and thank you very much for the opportunity once again. It was a pleasure to be in this panel.
Yeah, such powerful messages. Once again, thank you. I'm Josephine. It's been an honor, and until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Josephine Satyono, Executive Director of Indonesia Global Compact Network, moderator for. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their thoughts, knowledge, and experiences on the matter which was being discussed. Thanks a lot. Right, time for a short break. We are going for a short morning break right now. So while you're enjoying your perhaps breakfast or morning coffee, do drop by our exhibition booth. You can check out companies or partners Sarawak Energy Berhad, Capital Markets Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia Berhad, and Tenaga Nasional Berhad TMB. Have a quick chat with their representative and find out how they play their role in accelerating the SDGs. And coming up at 11, the second panel discussion on just transition, how we can create a cleaner, greener, and climate-friendly ASEAN. That's happening at 11. I'll see you then at 11. Enjoy your break. Do drop by at our virtual exhibition booth. I'll see you at 11. Bye for now.